The incense still clings heavily to her habit. Sister Lucia is 26 years old, and she can smell the myrrh and frankincense from the morning prayers mixing with something else entirely now: smoke. And underneath the smoke, the copper salt tang of blood seeping through the cathedral stones. She was, until 3 hours ago, a bride of Christ at the convent of Santa Maria del Carmine. A woman who had taken vows at 16 and spent 10 years in contemplation, prayer, and the quiet work of illuminating manuscripts that the monastery sold to churches throughout the Italian peninsula. Now she crouches behind the altar of Otranto's cathedral, her white habit stained with soot and other things she does not want to examine. Her hands pressed over the mouth of a girl barely 15, a novice who had been at the convent for only 6 months to prevent her screaming from revealing their position to the soldiers she can hear moving through the nave. Through a gap between the altar and the wall, she can see what is unfolding. Ottoman soldiers are methodically working through the cathedral, pulling people from their hiding places, separating them into groups. The men are being bound and led outside toward the hill that the people of Otranto call the Minerva. The women are being handled differently. The soldiers are examining them, evaluating, making assessments that Lucia recognizes from her father's livestock markets, the calculation of value that precedes sale. She was born Lucia Ferrante, daughter of a merchant who traded in wool and olive oil. She knows what commerce looks like. She knows what happens when human beings become merchandise. Outside, she can hear Archbishop Stefano Agricoli praying. His voice carries through the shattered doors of the cathedral, calm and clear despite what must be happening to him. He is reciting the Credo. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And she can hear other voices joining his. Hundreds of male voices raised in the profession of faith that will be their final words. Then the voice stops mid-phrase. She hears something that sounds like sawing. She hears the Archbishop scream, but only briefly. And then a sound she will carry with her for the rest of her life. The wet, heavy sound of something being torn apart. The novice beneath her hand convulses, trying to scream. Lucia presses harder, her own tears running silently down her cheeks, her lips moving in prayers she cannot voice. A soldier appears at the altar. He is young, perhaps 20, his face still bearing the softness of adolescence despite the hardness in his eyes. He looks at Lucia and the novice with an expression she cannot read. Not cruelty exactly, but not mercy either. Assessment, calculation, the evaluation of property. These two, he calls in accented Italian, still young, undamaged. Other soldiers approach, hands grab Lucia's arms, drag her from behind the altar, tear her habit as she struggles. The novice is similarly seized. Her screams finally released as the hand that silenced her is pulled away. They are dragged through the cathedral, past the bodies of priests who tried to defend their flock, past the elderly and the children who have been deemed without value, and left where they fell. They are taken through doors that once welcomed the faithful and now open onto a city that has become an abattoir. Otranto is burning. The smoke rises in columns that Lucia can see for miles, marking the destruction of everything she has known. The walls that protected the city for centuries are breached in 3 places. The streets are filled with soldiers moving in organized groups, some carrying plunder, some dragging prisoners, some finishing the work of conquest in ways that make Lucia close her eyes and pray for blindness. But she cannot close her ears. She hears everything. The screams, the prayers, the orders shouted in Turkish, the begging in Italian that accomplishes nothing. She hears the sounds of a city dying, and she memorizes them because somewhere beneath her terror is the understanding that someone must survive to tell this story. That what is happening here must not be forgotten. She is a witness. she does not yet know that witnessing will become her purpose, that the testimony she will eventually give will help convince a pope that holy war was the only possible response to what the Ottomans did at Otranto. But that comes later. For now, she is dragged toward the harbor, toward the ships that will carry her away from everything she has ever known, toward a fate that the soldiers are already discussing in terms she is beginning to understand. Prize, property, pleasure. The words follow her through the streets of the burning city. What you are about to learn has been systematically excluded from the histories that celebrate the martyrs of Otranto. The 800 men who refused to convert to Islam and were beheaded on the hill of Minerva are famous. They were canonized by Pope Francis in 2013, recognized as saints who chose death over apostasy, held up as examples of faith that refused to break under the most extreme pressure. Their story is told in churches, taught in schools, commemorated in monuments throughout southern Italy. But the story of what happened to the women, the wives, daughters, and sisters of those 800 men, and the nuns of the convents that dotted the city, that story has never been told publicly. The church that canonized the male martyrs has never acknowledged what happened to the female survivors because the women's fate was considered shameful rather than holy. Tonight, you will learn what the church has hidden for over 500 years. You will learn what Ottoman soldiers did to the women of Otranto in the days after the city fell. You will learn about the nuns of Santa Maria del Carmine, who were taken from their convent and subjected to treatment that the sources describe only in Latin in documents that were sealed in Vatican archives for centuries. You will learn why the Ottoman commander Ahmed Pasha kept the women alive when he killed the men. You will learn about the slave ships that departed Otranto for markets in Albania and beyond. Subscribe if you want to understand the full horror of what happened at Otranto in 1480. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because the 800 martyrs are only half the story. The other half, the half involving the women, is what truly made the Pope authorize holy war. But before I tell you what happened to Sister Lucia and the other women of Otranto, I need to take you back to July 1480, when Ottoman sails first appeared on the horizon. And the people of this small Italian city realized that the war they had heard about for decades had finally come to their shores. The Ottoman Empire in 1480 was the most powerful military force in the world. Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople 27 years earlier, had spent the intervening decades expanding Ottoman territory in every direction. The Mediterranean itself was becoming an Ottoman lake, with raids on Christian shipping growing more frequent and more devastating each year. When the Ottoman fleet appeared on the 28th of July, 1480, it carried approximately 18,000 soldiers under the command of Gedik Ahmed Pasha. Otranto had a garrison of perhaps 400 soldiers and a civilian population of approximately 6,000. The walls were medieval, designed for an earlier era of warfare, inadequate against Ottoman siege techniques. The siege lasted 15 days. Ottoman cannons shattered sections of the wall. Ottoman soldiers captured prisoners outside the walls and executed them in view of the defenders. Ottoman messengers offered terms: convert to Islam, surrender the city, accept Ottoman rule, or face the consequences. The city refused. On August 11th, the walls were breached in 3 places simultaneously. Ottoman soldiers poured into the city and the killing began. Now let us return to Sister Lucia, who was in the convent of Santa Maria del Carmine when the walls fell. The Mother Superior, a woman of 60 named Sister Benedetta, had led them in constant prayer. "We must accept God's will," Sister Benedetta had told them as the sounds of battle drew closer. "If martyrdom comes, we will embrace it. If life continues, we will serve as He directs." When Ottoman soldiers began battering at the door, Lucia discovered that faith and fear could coexist in the same terrified heart. The door shattered. Soldiers poured into the courtyard where the sisters had gathered. 23 women in white habits. Sister Benedetta stepped forward, her rosary raised, her voice strong. "We are brides of Christ," she said in Latin, then repeated it in Italian when the soldiers showed no understanding. "We are consecrated to God. We are not." The soldier's blade opened her throat before she could finish the sentence. The soldiers moved through the remaining sisters with terrifying efficiency. The elderly were killed immediately because they had no value in the markets where survivors would be sold. The young were examined. Lucia was young, healthy, her face unmarked by age or disease. She was valuable. She was allowed to live. 12 sisters survived the initial massacre. They were bound with ropes that bit into wrists accustomed to prayer beads. They were marched from the convent through streets where the massacre was still ongoing. They were taken to the cathedral where hundreds of other women had fled seeking sanctuary. The sanctuary had failed. The women were being sorted like livestock at market. But one of the sisters could understand Turkish. Sister Elena translated what she heard in whispered fragments. "They are taking the young women to Albania. There are markets there. Buyers who pay well for Italian women, especially those who are," she hesitated, "untouched. Brides of Christ." Lucia felt something shift inside her. The fear did not disappear, but it was joined by something harder. Rage. The cold, steady rage of someone who intends to survive. She would remember everything. She would survive, and she would tell the world what the Ottomans did at Otranto. The massacre of the men took place the following morning. The 800 who had become famous as martyrs were gathered on the hill of Minerva, where the entire surviving population could witness what happened to those who refused to convert. Lucia watched from the harbor, bound with other women on the deck of a ship. She could see the hill clearly, could see the men kneeling in rows, could see the Ottoman executioners moving among them with blades that caught the morning sun. She recognized faces. Antonio Ferrante, her cousin, Marco the blacksmith, Father Giovanni, the young priest who had heard her confessions. They were given a final chance to convert. One by one, a Turkish interpreter offered them life in exchange for faith. One by one, they refused. The killing took hours. 800 men beheaded individually, their blood soaking into the hill until the earth itself seemed to run red. Archbishop Stefano Agricoli was killed differently. The sawing had begun at the groin and proceeded upward. His death had taken nearly an hour. This was done because the Ottomans wanted the watching women to understand what would happen to anyone who resisted. Women who had been praying fell silent. Women who had been hoping for rescue understood that rescue would not come. Their fate was different. Worse in some ways because death would have been an ending, and they were being preserved for purposes that had no ending in sight. The ships departed Otranto that evening, carrying approximately 5,000 captives, mostly women and children. They sailed east toward Albania, toward markets that had been purchasing Italian captives for decades. Lucia watched Otranto recede until it was nothing but smoke on the horizon. She memorized the direction of the smoke, the color of the sky, the faces of the soldiers who had killed everyone she knew. She would need these memories later, when Pope Sixtus IV demanded to know exactly what had happened. Now, I need to tell you something about what happened on those ships. The women of Otranto were not simply transported from their city to the slave markets of Albania. The journey was itself part of their ordeal. The nuns of Santa Maria del Carmine fell into a middle category. Their status as consecrated virgins made them valuable. but there were 12 of them, more than any single buyer would want. Some would be sold intact. Others could be distributed among officers who had earned rewards. Commander Gedik Ahmed Pasha selected 4 nuns for immediate use by his senior officers. The remaining 8, including Lucia, were designated for market. What happened in those cabins during the crossing was audible throughout the ship. Screaming that continued for hours, then silence that was somehow worse. When dawn broke over the Albanian coast, one of the 4 selected nuns was dead. Sister Elena had somehow managed to throw herself over the rail during the night. The remaining 3 were dragged onto the deck as the ship approached harbor. They could not walk without assistance. They could not speak coherently. Lucia looked at them and understood what had been intended for all of them. She added this understanding to the testimony she was building in her mind. The slave market at Vor was where the women of Otranto were sorted for final sale. The market infrastructure was well developed, holding pens, examination facilities, auction blocks. Lucia and the surviving nuns were processed through this system with efficiency. They were stripped of their habits and given rough shifts that provided minimal coverage. They were examined by men who checked their teeth, their skin, their bodies. During those days of waiting, Lucia gathered testimony. She spoke to every woman who would talk. She memorized everything because she had nothing to write with. She built a catalog of atrocity in her mind. A woman named Giovanna told her about the cathedral where Ottoman soldiers had cornered women seeking sanctuary and worked through them systematically for 3 days. My daughter, Giovanna, wept. They took my daughter. She was only 12 years old. They gave her to a soldier as a reward. A woman named Caterina told her about the archbishop's death. The sawing had not been random brutality. It had been calculated to prolong suffering. They made me watch, Caterina whispered. They held my face so I couldn't look away. They said this is what happens to those who resist. The auction was held on the 5th day after their arrival. Lucia was sold to a merchant named Hamza Alctor, a trader who specialized in Italian captives. The price was 28 ducats, higher than average, reflecting her literacy and her status as a former nun. You will serve in my household until a suitable buyer is found, he told Lucia. You will work, you will obey. You will not attempt escape because escape is impossible. She worked in his household for 11 months. During those months, she continued gathering testimony. She learned about the market for Italian women, the destinations, Ottoman harems, wealthy households, brothels in port cities. Through tenuous connections, word of what had happened at Otranto began to reach Christian Europe. Pope Sixtus IV received reports from multiple sources. He learned about the 800 martyrs. He learned about the women whose fates were described in terms that the official records softened. And he learned that the Ottomans were not finished. More attacks were planned. The Pope began planning his response. Lucia's opportunity for escape came 13 months after her capture. Sultan Mehmed II had died, and the succession struggle had thrown the Ottoman military into disarray. Otranto returned to Christian control. But for the captives already transported to Albania, the liberation meant nothing. They were still property. Hamza's business suffered during the instability. He began selling at reduced prices. Lucia was purchased by a Greek merchant named Nicholas Papadopoulos, whose wife needed domestic help. Nicholas was Orthodox Christian. His household included a chapel. His trade connections reached Venice. Lucia saw her chance. I am a nun, she told Nicholas's wife, Maria. I was captured at Otranto. I have testimony that the Pope needs to hear. If you help me reach Christian territory, the Church will reward you. Maria was skeptical, but Lucia was different. She was calm, precise, detailed. "What testimony?" Maria asked. Lucia told her. The massacre on the hill, the women of the cathedral, the ships, the markets, the systematic distribution of Christian women throughout Ottoman territory. Maria wept. "My cousin was in Crete when the Ottomans came," Maria said. "She was taken. We never learned what happened to her. Every day for 15 years, I have imagined it." "Help me reach Venice," Lucia said, "and I will tell the Pope everything." Maria helped. The journey from Albania to Venice took 3 months. Lucia traveled hidden in cargo holds, disguised as a merchant's wife. She arrived in Venice in December 1481, nearly 18 months after her capture. She was thin, exhausted, but she was free, and she carried in her mind testimony that would change how Pope Sixtus IV understood the Ottoman threat. The Venetian authorities were skeptical, but Lucia had details that could be verified. Her account was transcribed by a Venetian scribe. The document was sent to Rome. Pope Sixtus IV read the testimony personally. Lucia's testimony added something that the accounts of male martyrdom did not include: a systematic description of what happened to the women, the deliberate, calculated destruction of thousands of Christian wives, daughters, and consecrated virgins. The Pope's response was recorded in correspondence that survives in the Vatican archives. He was horrified, not just by the martyrdoms, but by the fates of the women, which were ongoing, which continued every day in Ottoman households and markets and brothels. The crusade he called for was not only to avenge the martyrs, it was to rescue the living. Lucia did not stop testifying. She traveled to Rome, where she met with papal officials. She became one of the most important sources of intelligence about the Ottoman threat available to Christian Europe. She also searched for her sisters from the convent. Of the 7 nuns who had survived, she had lost track of all but one, Sister Magdalene, who was eventually ransomed by relatives. Together, the 2 surviving nuns provided a picture of the Ottoman captive system that no male observer could have compiled. The 3 nuns who had been distributed to officers on the ship, Sister Clara, Sister Agata, and Sister Francesca, were never found. Lucia added them to the list of martyrs that she compiled. Not the official martyrs, but the other martyrs, the women who had been denied the opportunity for holy death. She continued gathering testimony from other survivors. She became a collector of horror, a compiler of atrocities, a woman whose purpose was to ensure that the fates of Christian women in Ottoman captivity would never be forgotten. The crusade that Pope Sixtus IV called for never materialized in the form he envisioned. The Italian states were too divided, but the Pope's response had other effects. Financial support flowed to the Knights of St. John, ransoming efforts were organized, and the testimony that Lucia provided entered the historical record. Lucia lived for another 43 years, dying in 1524 at the age of 70. She never returned to religious life, but she continued testifying until her death. She also wrote her own account, not a formal testimony for official purposes, but a personal narrative. This account was copied by a scribe in 1512 and preserved in a monastery library. The account is remarkable for its detail and its restraint. She described the massacre of the men, the seizure of the women, the distribution on the ships, the markets, the auctions. She described what she had learned about the system that had consumed so many women, the organization, the economics, the bureaucracy of captivity that made the Ottoman treatment of women not random brutality, but calculated destruction. This was what had made the Pope authorize holy war, not just the 800 martyrs whose deaths could be celebrated as holy sacrifice, but the thousands of women whose fates were too shameful for celebration, but too horrific for silence. Remember the women of Otranto. Remember that when Ottoman forces conquered that city in 1480, they killed 800 men and captured 5,000 women. Remember that the men are famous martyrs, canonized by the Church, commemorated in monuments and holidays. Remember that the women are almost completely forgotten. Remember Sister Lucia Ferrante, who crouched behind an altar while her mother superior was murdered, who was stripped of her habit and sold in markets designed for exactly this purpose, who survived captivity and returned to testify about what she had witnessed. Remember that the Church has never commemorated the women. The 800 male martyrs have their saint's day, their shrine, their recognition. The 5,000 women have nothing because their fate was considered shameful, because survival in the circumstances they faced required accepting things that the Church could not acknowledge. Remember Sister Clara, Sister Agatada, and Sister Francesca, the 3 nuns distributed to Ottoman officers on the ship, whose screaming was audible throughout the crossing, whose fates remained unknown despite decades of searching. Remember that what happened at Otranto was not unique. Ottoman raids had been taking Christian women for decades before 1480 and would continue for centuries afterward. Remember that the history we inherit is shaped by what people chose to record and what they chose to suppress. The male martyrs of Otranto became famous because their deaths fit a narrative that the Church wanted to celebrate. The female survivors of Otranto were suppressed because their experiences fit no narrative that the Church could embrace. Remember that testimony matters. Lucia survived not just physically, but purposefully, carrying in her mind the record of what she had witnessed, ensuring that the women of Otranto would not be completely forgotten. Remember that what Ottoman soldiers did to the nuns of Otranto made the Pope authorize holy war. Not the deaths of 800 men, however holy, but the ongoing horror of thousands of women, however shameful. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand the martyrs of Otranto from the famous story of 800 men who chose death over apostasy. Because those 800 are only half the story. The martyrs died in a single day. The women suffered for years, decades, lifetimes in some cases. The martyrs were celebrated. The women were forgotten until now. Remember Sister Lucia Ferrante. Remember the nuns of Santa Maria del Carmen. Remember the women of Otranto. Remember what the Church has chosen to suppress. Remember. If this forgotten history moved you, subscribe. Every subscription helps us unearth the next buried truth and fight historical erasure. We refuse to let their voices fade into the dust.